On Primetime Politics tonight, as the protests and blockades continue and provinces begin to lift pandemic restrictions, the pressure mounts on the federal government to rethink its pandemic approach. MPs will be here to debate the protests, the easing restrictions, and how the federal government should respond. The Premier of Saskatchewan joins me to discuss his decision to end key pandemic measures in an effort to heal divisions in his province. And the country's most important border crossing has been disrupted by protests, and that has national economic implications. The Mayor of Windsor joins me to discuss the impact and the plan to get goods flowing again. We'll begin tonight with the many moving parts of the latest pandemic-related developments in this country. In Ottawa, the protest continues for a 13th day, but is now mostly silent because of a court injunction banning the honking of horns. Police today finally warned protesters if they're blocking roads, they could be charged. There are reports that some members of the Ottawa protest will be heading to Toronto to protest there. For a third day in a row, protesters continue to restrict access to the busiest border crossing in Canada, the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor. The protests are disrupting supply chains with the United States and could lead to factory layoffs and shortages of fresh produce. And even as Alberta and other provinces begin to scrap public health restrictions, the border crossing at Coutts, Alberta continues to be disrupted by protesters, with police promising escalating enforcement measures starting tonight. In the House of Commons today, the Prime Minister faced more questions about the protests, those blockades, and the COVID restrictions.
The science and the evidence is just simply not on the Prime Minister's side. Many of the reasons previously used to keep Canadians under restrictions are vanishing before our eyes. Other countries are opening up. Provinces are opening up. As he just said, 90% of Canadians have the vaccine. The Prime Minister needs to put his ego aside. He needs to do what's right for the country. He needs to end the mandates. He needs to end the restrictions. He needs to listen to his own caucus. Will he do that?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Canadians have made it through this pandemic better than many other places because Canadians stepped up. They were there for each other. Their government had their backs. We worked closely with provincial and territorial leaders. Every step of the way, we kept focusing on vaccinations, on public health supports, on business supports. It's allowed us through, and Canadians are continuing to get vaccinated. 60,000 Canadians got vaccinated with their first dose just last week. We are continuing to make sure Canadians get vaccinated because this is how we get through this pandemic.
Well, let's bring in three members of Parliament now to talk about what is happening across the land in this country. Yasir Naqvi is the Liberal MP for Ottawa Centre, where the protest is located, including Parliament Hill, of course. He's also the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Emergency Preparedness. Melissa Lantsman is an Ontario Conservative MP and her party's transport critic. And Taylor Bachrach is a British Columbia New Democrat MP and his party's transport critic. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here. Mr. Naqvi, let me start with you. You and your government condemn these protests. You have described the protesters as lawbreakers, but they're still there. What Canadians see is protesters running the streets and government so far unable or unwilling to stop that. Why is that?
Well, Peter, I represent the riding of Ottawa Centre, where Parliament Hill is located. My community has been under siege now for almost two weeks. My constituents, people who live in the downtown core, have been harassed. They've been intimidated. They've been yelled at. The businesses have been shuttered essentially because they cannot operate. We need to make sure that this protest, this occupation comes to end now because it's impacting people and their lives.
Right, but let me just jump in. But you and others have been saying this for 2 weeks now, and it's still there. And so people watching, they're going, "Look, somebody do something."
Yeah, it's a law enforcement issue. We need to make sure that all law enforcement agencies, led by Ottawa Police, put an end to this protest. We've been working very closely with Ottawa Police Services, making sure that they have all the resources they need by way of RCMP. I know the provincial government has provided them OPP officers, and there are other police services from the province there as well. We need to ensure that the law is enforced and this occupation of downtown Ottawa comes to an end.
All right. But after a couple of weeks, Ottawa police told the protesters today, Melissa Lantsman, that they risk being charged if they're blocking streets. That's 2 weeks into the protest. Your party's been largely supportive of the protesters in Ottawa. Do you support these protests and the effect they're having, not just the ones here, but the ones across the country?
I think the ones across the country speak to the frustration that Canadians are seeing, and we've seen them in all capitals, and we've seen them at all legislatures, and we see them continuously popping up. Now, where I think that right to protest stops is when you've got a blockade, and you've got a blockade on critical infrastructure. It is our party that brought forward an attempt to try to add the blocking of a critical infrastructure with harsher sentences in a bill that we discussed in this Parliament, and we were laughed off by the Liberal government. So, look, I think this is entirely because of a lack of leadership, and it didn't have to get to this. And there is one thing that the Prime Minister can do to take the temperature down, and it's to stop alienating Canadians, it's to stop dividing Canadians, and it's to bring forward a plan to end the restrictions and end the mandates.
All right, I want to get to that as our discussion continues here, but let me bring in Taylor Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, what's missing from the government's response?
Well, the buck stops with the Prime Minister, and there needs to be a plan. At this point, we have all of these different jurisdictions all pointing fingers at each other, and we have the downtown of a capital city of a G7 country, and we don't have control over it. So that is a huge problem. Now, to Melissa's point, one of the things that we've seen members of her party out there in the streets taking selfies with the people who are blockading the downtown and kind of egging them on. And I appreciate that she's called for the blockaders to go home, but that's not a consistent message that we're hearing. Now, this is having a profound effect on the people of Ottawa, and peaceful protest aimed at government policy is one thing, but the people who are being hurt here are downtown businesses, people who are trying to go to work, people who are trying to live their lives. And it's time that this was brought to an end, and ultimately there needs to be a plan, and I believe that the responsibility falls at the feet of the Prime Minister. For a week we didn't even hear from the guy.
Okay, let's pivot the conversation to that then. Mr. Naqvi, let me turn to you here. The protests are unfolding in this context of more and more provinces backing off their pandemic restrictions. So the conversation in the land now is very much alive over lifting restrictions. So what additional pressure does that put on your government in dealing with these protesters and their demands to end vaccine mandates and other restrictions, and to present Canadians with a roadmap for living with COVID-19?
Well, Peter, from the very beginning, our government has been focused on dealing with this global pandemic by relying on science, by ensuring that we're taking the best advice from public health experts as to how we're going to put an end to this global pandemic right here in Canada. Science needs to drive policy here, not politics like the Conservative Party has been doing with this particular issue. And science has told us again and again that vaccination is our strongest tool available for us to put an end to this pandemic, and we'll continue to ensure that Canadians get vaccinated, get their triple shots, so that we can move through this pandemic and start rebuilding our lives.
Right, okay. Melissa Lantsman, the Prime Minister has become the key target of protesters, but look, Conservative premiers, and that's most of the premiers in the country, they've also introduced vaccine mandates and vaccine passports. Many are now lifting them, let's say that. Ontario says it has no plans to lift the mask mandate or vaccine passports for now, but how is this ideological when leaders across all parties have imposed restrictions?
Well, this isn't ideological, and I think the Liberals have frankly stopped looking at science, and they're engaging in political science. We have premiers across the country dropping restrictions. We have the Chief Medical Health Officer of Canada who have given the Liberals the green light to stop these mandates and stop these restrictions. We have members of their own caucus, Peter, now calling the Prime Minister a divisive leader, trying to pit Canadians against each other because of these mandates. All the government has to do right now is to present a plan to get us out of this pandemic and to get us to start living with COVID. It's not going anywhere. We are the highest vaccinated population, one of the highest in the world, at 90% of Canadians vaccinated. So I think I have a lot of questions, just like Canadians do. What's the threshold? Is it 92? Is it 94.7? The Prime Minister hasn't answered that question. In fact, he's answered no questions on this.
All right, Mr. Bachrach, the NDP Premier of your province in British Columbia is proceeding more cautiously on lifting restrictions, leaving it, he says, entirely to the medical experts to decide on the timing. Are you concerned some provinces are lifting restrictions too quickly? And tie that into some of your concerns about a federal roadmap to sort of tie it all together, give Canadians a sense of what they should expect.
Thanks, Peter. To the credit of Premier Horgan and the British Columbia government, our province has had some of the best outcomes throughout this pandemic, both healthcare-wise, health outcome-wise, and economically. So I think it is a really prudent approach that they've taken, listening to the public health advice and moving very cautiously. And they've been able to keep the province more open than many other provinces. We shouldn't be making major public health decisions based on the number of people who park their cars in the middle of the road. We need to absolutely follow the science. But where I agree with Melissa is that there needs to be a plan. And that's what we've been calling for. That's what Jagmeet called for in the House the other day. We need the Prime Minister to step forward and lead the way and show Canadians in a very transparent way, here's how we're going to work together across jurisdictions to get out of this crisis. Times of uncertainty like this are so critical for leadership, and we're just not seeing it.
Mr. Naqvi, we have a second Liberal MP from Quebec now. Yves Robillard has backed Joël Lightbound, another Quebec MP, accusing the Prime Minister of marginalizing opponents to his pandemic response for political reasons. Dividing and stigmatizing are the words he used. Do you acknowledge the divisions over this, and what responsibility do you think the Prime Minister bears?
No, the Prime Minister has been steadfast in his response as the leader of our country in fighting this pandemic from day one. He has relied on good science, relied on public health experts to do everything possible to protect Canadians, to have their back. Again, this is not the moment that we should start engaging in politics and start making political decisions.
But you have a colleague who said that moment was right after during the election, right after that you were engaging in the politics.
Well, we were very clear during the campaign that vaccination and vaccine mandates are important and necessary to put an end to this pandemic, and Canadians elected us. In fact, Canadians elected voted for more parties who supported vaccines and vaccine mandates than any other political party. And so we need to make sure that we get this job done. We need to ensure that we are listening to medical experts and not play politics with this issue as the Conservatives are doing, just because they have a leadership race going on. They're using this as a distraction. All right,
let me follow up on that with Melissa Lantsman. Ms. Lantsman, look at Canada's record of dealing with the pandemic. Yes, with tougher restrictions than many other countries, but one of the lowest death rates in the developed world, one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. Are those two things connected, and do they tell us that the rules in Canada have mostly worked?
We know that the virus has evolved, and we know that the science has changed, and the only thing that hasn't changed is the government's talking points. They are still using the same talking points as they were using a year ago, relying on the same metrics, even though we have more tools. So what we are asking for is a plan to see an end. That's a plan for business owners to have their businesses opened and not shuttered. That's a plan for families to mend their differences on these divisive mandates. The Prime Minister himself says the people that don't agree with him on these issues are un-Canadian. And we're calling for an end to that because Canadians have had enough. And you can see it in every downtown centre and in every legislature around the country.
Mr. Bachrach, a final word.
Peter, if I may just very quickly, Melissa may be engaging
real quick.
Melissa may be engaging in talking points. We're focused on creating sound public policy.
Okay,
good public health advice.
Mr. Bachrach, let me give the final word to you here. Should there be a discussion around the pivot point? Yes, deferring to science, but it's been a long time that Canadians have been living under the restrictions. What role do political leaders play in this, in sort of reading the room, the writ large? The room is Canada, and how much people are prepared to tolerate.
Sure. The most important commodity right now is trust. And you get trust from transparency and from stepping forward and showing leadership during times of uncertainty. We need to see that transparent plan. I think there's broad agreement around that. We need to follow the science. We know that vaccines work. And at the same time, we need to focus on our healthcare system and plugging some of the holes that have become evident over the course of the past 2 years. We need a plan for investment, for hospital beds, so that we don't find ourselves in this critical situation again. And frankly, every day that goes by without that plan is one more day that we're going to be in this very tough situation.
All right. I want to thank you all for your time tonight. Covered lots and lots more to cover as this conversation with Canadians continues. But thank you all for your time tonight. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Well, many provincial governments have now begun lifting pandemic restrictions, some more quickly than others. But there's a clear move across the country now to lift restrictions and public health orders for pandemic-weary residents. Alberta and Saskatchewan have announced they're ending vaccination passports and mask mandates, two of the more controversial measures that have caused a lot of division across the country. The Premier of Saskatchewan, Scott Moe, is with me now. Premier Moe, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me this evening. Can you start by telling me the timeline for ending the vaccination passports and the mask mandate in your province?
We will, this coming Monday, February the 14th, our vaccine passport system will no longer be in place. At the end of the month, February 28th, also a Monday, on that morning, that is when our public health order with respect to masking would expire, and we're not going to be renewing that. So masking will expire also on a Monday morning, February the 28th.
Premier, you're also ending the mandatory self-isolation at the end of the month for those who test positive for COVID-19. Why?
Well, again, this is a policy that has largely been performed by compliance, not by enforcement in Saskatchewan, and I think in fairness in many areas across Canada, if not all areas across Canada. And so we're going to continue asking Saskatchewan people to use their rapid tests at home if they do test positive. Exactly what they've been doing for a period of time now, and it's exactly what we expect they will continue to do.
Premier, why have you decided it's time to ease those pandemic restrictions now in your province? Some of your critics say, look, the Premier is leaning on politics and not relying on science. What do you say to those people?
Well, as we look at where Saskatchewan is, as well as other provinces across Canada, we've seen the peak with respect to numbers. We're starting to see those numbers decline, as well as our hospitalizations across the nation and in Saskatchewan also are starting on a positive trajectory, and that is good for everyone. And so what we've done is bring in a phased approach as to how we are going to remove the remaining public health measures that we have in Saskatchewan, given that we have tools available today that quite simply have not been available even 4 to 6 months ago. Widespread vaccines, many rapid tests, at-home rapid tests that are available for Saskatchewan people. We have early intervention treatments that are available today that were not available even a month or two ago. And so we're charting a course on behalf of Saskatchewan's people, and one that the majority of folks are requesting. And what we're hearing from the people in this province is that they are, given Omicron is a less severe strain than certainly Delta and previous strains, they're willing to live with the risk of COVID moving forward, given the tools that they have, as opposed to continuing to live with the public health measures that are in place. And I think you're seeing other provincial governments at least looking at similar conversations.
And a lot of leaders in other parts of the country are pointing to the divisions now that seem to be very much coming to the forefront in this country about these restrictions and how long we've been at this. How much of this decision is about that and what the divisions you may have seen in your province?
Well, the divisions that we have seen, many of them, have centered around some of the public health measures, in particular the vaccine passport that was in place that was necessary. We were reluctant to put it in Saskatchewan, but it was necessary during the Delta wave. I would put forward that it has run its course. It's increased our vaccination rate. Is not as necessary to continue on at this point in time. And this is a time now for us in this province as Saskatchewanians, but also across Canada as Canadians, to come together, to heal these divisions, and to really, look ahead as to what we are going to be able to achieve in a post-pandemic world. Now, that's not saying the pandemic is over, but we are going to have to learn, by many chief medical health officers' own statements, we are going to have to look at how we are going to live with COVID, use the tools that we have available, do our own personal risk assessments each and every day, and ensure that we are doing our very best to keep those and those around us safe, but also starting to chart a course back to normalcy in our communities, in our provinces, and in our nation.
What if restaurants? Is there any provision that restaurants could keep demanding the vaccine passports? I mean, there's a lot of people feel comfortable in a restaurant if they know everybody around them has been vaccinated. That may not be the case now when these rules change in Saskatchewan. There were legal protections for restaurant owners when the passport was in place. What about now?
So our goal is to move things back to as close to a pre-pandemic world as we can. We want to provide access for all people. For example, in our schools, for students, for staff, for teachers. We want to provide access for all people, unencumbered access for all people into restaurants, into retail businesses, into community gathering places, halls, the theaters, etc., without having to ask for health for any health records. And so the temporary protection that we had put in place for private business, for communities, is going to be removed on February the 14th. And so if someone does, and we would hope that everyone goes that direction, but if someone does feel that they want to continue on with the proof of vaccination policy in their place of business, there most certainly is going to be risks to that that they will have to consult on.
All right, they may face legal challenges then. Just very quickly, in about the 15 seconds I have left, what influence did the protests you're seeing across the country and have on the decision to ease any of these restrictions?
We see multiple protests, on various different issues over the years, and we hear the message. Their voices are always heard, and I think they're in particular being heard at this point in time. Many individuals that also reach out to their MLAs, and we listen very closely in Saskatchewan. We're fortunate to have a large caucus across much of the province, and they are engaging with individuals. Some of them involved in having their voice heard in various protests, whether it be in Regina, Ottawa, or other areas. But we do listen to those individuals on multiple topics, including their desire to really move forward living with COVID and seeing a reduction in the public health measures. And we would encourage the federal government to provide that roadmap for all Canadians. All
right. Saskatchewan's Premier Scott Moe. Always good to talk to you, Premier. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you, Peter.
The Ambassador Bridge crossing in Windsor is one of the busiest in all of Canada, and it's vital to the people of Windsor and the surrounding region. Windsor and the surrounding region rely heavily on travel back and forth between the border. Residents, small businesses, manufacturing sectors all require it. Right now, because of the convoy protests, truckers are being blocked, and it's severely impacting Windsor and the surrounding region. What is the Prime Minister doing to end that shut down and open up the border for the truckers to get back home and deliver the goods to Windsor and the surrounding region?
You're right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Ambassador Bridge is critical for trade, and this blockade poses significant risks to our supply chains. Illegally blocked trade routes means empty shelves, higher prices, and layoffs in the trucking, manufacturing, and retail sectors. It is ironic, Mr. Speaker, that a protest and a blockade that was ostensibly by truckers is now blockading truckers themselves. Mr. Speaker, Canadians have the right to peaceful protest, but they don't have the right to illegally block our roads or harass residents. So I want to once again thank the 90% of truckers who've been vaccinated and working hard every day to keep our economy moving.
Well, as I mentioned, it's been another day of disruption at Canada's busiest border crossing, the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Ontario. Some $350 million worth of trade with the United States crosses that bridge every day. That's 25% of Canada's total trade with the Americans. Let's bring in the Mayor of Windsor, Drew Dilkens. Mayor Dilkens, thanks for taking time to speak with me tonight. Look, what's the protest situation there now? What's the latest as we speak and the impact it's having on that crossing?
Well, it is having a huge impact, I can tell you that much. And right now we have northbound lanes open, which means truck traffic from Canada can get across the bridge into the United States. However, it is completely closed in the other direction. So trucks coming from Michigan cannot get into Canada because of the illegal blockade at the Ambassador Bridge. And as you mentioned, this is the busiest border crossing between our two countries. 8,000 to 10,000 trucks a day, over $300 million of goods each and every day. There are a lot of Canadians' livelihoods who rely on smooth and efficient border crossings, no more so than in my own community.
Tell me a little more about that. Give our viewers a greater sense of the impact this protest is having, not just on your city, but more broadly on the national economy.
Well, this is an issue for us regionally, of course, but it's a huge issue for Ontario, and it has both national and international significance. And so I know for a fact, within the first hour of the closure, our largest employer, Stellantis, who makes the Chrysler Pacifica and minivan right here in Windsor, was on the phone saying, what's going on at the Ambassador Bridge? The impact was felt that quickly because the entire auto industry that is built up on the Canadian side here in Windsor as the auto capital of Canada, and of course in Detroit as the auto capital of the US, those supply chains are extremely tightly integrated. And the average part that goes into a vehicle that comes off the finish line in the assembly plant, it crosses the border 6 to 7 times. And so it has a big impact on those operations. And of course, that entire sector operates in a just-in-time delivery world, which means there are no parts sitting idle in the plant. They are brought just in time to be put into the vehicles that are being made. So the impact is big, it is material, and it was felt immediately.
Okay, let's talk about a possible resolution here. These protesters, not just in Windsor, but in Ottawa and in Alberta, are pushing back mostly against pandemic measures taken by provincial and federal governments here. So they want an end to those restrictions and those mandates. What they want, seems to me, you can't give them. So what's being negotiated with the protesters?
You know, what we're trying to do is recognize that we live in a democracy, and part of one of the hallmarks of democracy is the ability to protest and demonstrate and express yourself. That is okay. What is not okay is blocking the busiest trade corridor between our two countries. And so what police have been trying to do very delicately is get a lane open in each direction so that international traffic can continue to flow while recognizing that protesters can continue to do what they think they need to do. But the situation on the ground with some of these folks, to be quite frank, is that they really believe that this is a cause, or that they are fighting for a cause that is worth dying for. And so that type of sentiment translates into different behavior on the ground than any normal protest. And so police are doing all that they can to keep the peace. They're doing all that they can to make sure that no one gets hurt. But at some point, you will need federal, provincial. We're certainly here on the municipal side to help with some resolution, but it will require an intervention from other levels of government to see this move on.
All right, I'll let you get back to dealing with it. Mayor Dilkens, thanks so much for your time tonight, and good luck there in Windsor. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Peter.
That is all for this edition of Primetime Politics. I'm Peter Van Dusen. For all of us here at CPAC, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.